You're hearing The Frank Beckmann Show, News Talk 760 WJR. Sitting in for Frank, here's ML Elric.
And we are back with Nick Dranias, the President and Executive Director of the Compact for America. He's the recent General Counsel and Constitutional Policy Director of the Goldwater Institute. And he's got some thoughts on balancing our budgets. And when I say our budgets, I don't mean yours, I don't mean mine, I mean the United States of America's budget, which sounds like a pretty tall order. How are we going to do this, Nick?
Well, we got to pass a balanced budget amendment, and we got to do it with the huge majorities that just resulted from the last election. I mean, we have right now 31 governors that are probably receptive. We have at least 40 chambers in the state houses and senates that are probably receptive. We can originate a balanced budget amendment from the states. The time is now.
So you're not confident that even with these Republican majorities in Congress, that this balanced budget amendment is going to come from Washington?
Well, I think that there's going to be some cooperation. We actually have a congressional resolution that we need to activate this process. It only needs simple majorities. It doesn't need to be signed by the president. And we already have a sponsor in Congressman Paul Gosar. And we're told that there's a huge number of folks in the Liberty Caucus that also support it. And on the Senate side, we're hoping to bring a wide spectrum from the center to the center right, maybe even some people close to the center left if they're receptive. There was a time when a balanced budget amendment was not a right-left issue.
Well, I do remember, I think it was Pete Peterson trying to get the balance with the Concord Coalition and, boy, I'm going way back now, but Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman, where this was a pretty bipartisan, a fairly, I don't want to say mild, but a pretty reasonable proposal. It wasn't seen as left or right. Are you getting a sense now that this is considered a right-wing issue rather than a middle-of-the-road issue?
I think it's a power issue, right? And when the center-left perceives itself in power, then suddenly the majority doesn't want to do anything to limit its power. When the center-right's in power, suddenly they don't want to limit their power. Right now, it is perceived to be somewhat center-right, but I had a great meeting with one of the researchers over at Concord Coalition, which is still around in Raleigh, North Carolina, about 2-3 weeks ago, and she was a little bit excited, maybe overly so, given her context. But the basic idea here is we can, with just 36 more states and one simple majority resolution in Congress, get the job done. And we already secured Georgia and Alaska last session, and that we only targeted 4 states at that point. We've got 10 states already on the boards to carry the bill this year. We've got 4 of those that have already drafted or dropped the bill. And in Congress, you know, we're hopeful that in the Senate we might see Senator Mike Lee and Senator Murkowski join hands and sponsor it on the Senate side, and we're hopeful that that Paul Gosar, Representative Paul Gosar, will be able to bring on board into the limelight all the members of his Liberty Caucus and even leadership that would support it.
Now, how many states require their state budget to be balanced?
Well, this is the joke. You mentioned how radical seemingly this balanced budget amendment idea is, or in the eyes of some folks on the center left. But the reality is 49 states out of 50 have either a constitutional, statutory, or court decision-based balanced budget requirement. 41 of them have it actually in their state constitution. The only state that doesn't really seem to care about this is Vermont. So, you know, think about it. I mean, the federal government is more radical in having unlimited borrowing capacity than California, than New York, than Massachusetts. I mean, the federal government is almost in a class of its own.
Now, I want you to play devil's advocate for a minute and tell us why should we not have a balanced budget amendment? Why is it that the feds think that it's okay for them to have no cap on their spending, no accountability to zero out their budget at the end of the year?
Well, you know, the only arguments that you ever get in opposition to this idea is that you need to borrow to fund a war, or you might have a Katrina event, or you might have Yellowstone blow up, or something like along those lines. But the reality is, if the bond markets are still functioning and you can still sell your bonds and therefore borrow, it's probably not going to be a cataclysm of that order going on, right? So, I mean, if something on the order of like a meteor striking us happens, there's not going to be a bond market to borrow from, right? So, but the other thing is, what's different about our balanced budget amendment proposals, you can go to compactforamerica.org, and you can read it. It actually exists. It's in the compact, the agreement among the states that has already been passed in 2 states that we're hoping Michigan will carry and 10 other states. You can read the amendment. The amendment does not say tomorrow we stop borrowing. What the amendment says is you get a line of credit. you get 105% of whatever's outstanding when it's ratified. So if there's $20 trillion outstanding, you get a $21 trillion line of credit. It's a big line of credit. All you have to do is pay it down in good times, and you can borrow in bad times. And for at least 50 years, at any level of growth that's reasonable, a $21 trillion line of credit is enough to handle anything.
You would hope so. How out of whack is our budget right now? I mean, if we're not balanced, how far off are we?
You know, it's a really interesting situation right now. If you talk to the Congressional Budget Office, they say it's only a $485 billion deficit only. But if you look at the OMG, which still has not adjusted its numbers and still is, I guess, you're relying on it, they say it's $685 billion. You know, there's enough accounting gimmicks going on that you can probably play around with the numbers within $100 billion or $200 billion apparently. But the point is this: we owe over $18 trillion, $100 billion right now. That is more than the value of everything we produce in a year. And that unlimited credit card is making it possible for us to promise huge amounts of unfunded entitlement programs, the present value of which is anywhere from $80 trillion to $220 trillion. I mean, it's like if you made $50,000, you decided to take out a $3.5 million mortgage.
Yeah, good luck getting that through the bank. And when you say we're $685 million off, I think OMG is probably the right term. I mean, that is way off.
Yeah, you know what? I didn't notice that till now. That's awesome.
Well, and you know, I balance my budget. I try and pay my credit cards in full every month, and I'm lucky I have a job, so I'm able to do that. But what would happen immediately in Washington if this went through? How would we see changes? What benefits would we realize?
Well, the key thing is this. I mean, would you ever do anything reasonable in your budget if you had the ability to borrow anything at all times? I mean, everyone talks about cutting fraud, waste, and abuse, but why would you bother? How would you even know how to measure it if you've got unlimited resources or the appearance of unlimited resources, right? And the only way that you ever become concerned about fraud, waste, abuse, prioritizing, budgeting, all those things only become meaningful if you've got a sense that you have limited resources. And so the first thing we would see if you had a limited borrowing capacity in the federal government is suddenly an attention to, well, maybe we should be more efficient. Maybe we should prioritize. Maybe we should have a budget. You know, we haven't had one of those crazy things in almost 20 years.
Well, how much of that is because of a difference in philosophy, and how much of it is just the children in Washington not playing together very well?
You know, it goes back to 1997. I mean, there's been times when things were less rancorous, and then there's been times when it's been more rancorous. The real problem is this. If you give a politician an unlimited ability to shift the cost of his promises to future non-voting generations, they will continue to do so until the system crashes, because they have nothing to lose. They have nothing to lose in a narrow, self-interested way. Think about it. If you could buy steaks at Ruth's Chris and send the bill to the next table 20 years from now, what would stop you? I'd
probably get the mashed potatoes as well. Yeah, that's the consequences really seem to be the thing that make this, I guess, a reason to do it, but also a reason why people won't do it.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, you know, China owns $1.2 trillion of our bonds right now. Even though we have $18 trillion outstanding, if they decided to fire sell those, they could easily, you know, bump our interest rates up to historic levels. If that happens, then all of a sudden $200 billion disappears out of our budget. $200 billion is basically like 10-20% of the discretionary spending. I mean, now you start ending programs. You start dramatically cutting military spending, right? So right now, as we speak, we're living on borrowed time, no pun intended. I mean, literally our national security is in the hands of the prudence of potential adversaries.
Well, that's a scary thought from Nick Dranias, President and Executive Director of the Compact for America. He's going to be here in Michigan on January 15th, speaking at the Friends of Liberty, and he wants a balanced budget amendment. We'll see how he does. It seems like the time may be ripe.